That is the moment when the Iranian diaspora and the Iranian people have to be very loud and noisy and say it's not good enough to just return to Islamic Republic light. We want democracy. We want to take our country back.
Thousands and thousands of people, if not millions, that are willing to get back. I'm not sure about, fighting with guns, but I'm 100% sure I would be one of them to get back and help to rebuild my own country.
The stories break my heart. But the idea that you have parents looking for the bodies of their children through unmarked, body bags. The idea that they would sell the bodies back for the price of the bullets. It's disgusting, and it infuriates me in a lot of ways.
There is a quote by Karim Sajjadpouri that at the beginning of Islamic Revolution, so there were maybe 80%, ideologues, 20% charlatans, but right now it's reversed.
My hope is that what we are seeing now is the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic and this failed experiment. And Iranians will begin to take their country back.
The level of ignorance is unbelievable. Why no one paid enough attention. That's why children of revolution in Iran, so they blaming their parents for being fooled by a cleric.
Now we'll look at, 1970s as a golden age for Iran compared to what they have to live under now, which is where there's drinking water crisis. The currency is worth nothing. There are all the scandals, I've tried to follow it, of banks collapsing because of the graft of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, pensions being looted. This is no way, people despise that.
Right now, tensions across the region feel unusually high.
Yes.
From your perspective, what are the most important forces shaping the current escalation?
It probably wasn't 5 months away because of Operation Midnight Hammer and Operation Rising Lion from the 12-Day War. But, the reason why Iran now is because they were penetrated by Israel and so weak that this was maybe the best opportunity to end the regime.
When they killed 30 to 40,000 Iranian citizens in 2 days.
Right.
So I cannot imagine those kind of people, have got access to nuclear weapons. So I cannot imagine that.
The tragedy of the 90 million Iranians who have to live under this death call, where their leadership would prefer to have their people starved and living in deprivation so they can continue to try to kill Americans and Israelis and others in the Middle East through their terror networks or whatever. It was Ruhollah Khomeini who represented, a version of political Islam in the Shia religion that stole the revolution and purged out other competition. That is a risky gamble, because we don't know what's going to come next. And we are potentially opening up a series of things that I hope it isn't, but we have to keep open the possibility that things may be worse. There might be chaos and anarchy. There's Iranian Americans, Iranian Canadians that I've met, Amir, are some of the most talented, ambitious people I know.
Eli Lake, welcome to Beyond the Summit.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
You're one of the rare journalists who manages to connect breaking news with deep historical context. Through your reporting and your podcast, Breaking History, you've shown that today's geopolitical crises don't just appear overnight. They grow out of decades, sometimes centuries of political decisions, ideological struggles, and human ambition. Your work on Iran in particular stands out because you treat it not just as a policy problem or a headline, but as a nation with a long and complicated history. Thank you for being here again.
Oh, well, it's great. That's what I aspire to do. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Eli, before we dive into geopolitics, I want people to know the person behind the analysis. What first pulled you toward foreign policy and national security reporting?
I was fairly early in my career. I had been covering Washington and the Environmental Protection Agency, mainly, and the Education Department for newsletters, which meant that I had to make sources in Washington and gave me a sense of how Washington worked. And then I kind of got my first big break. It was with a newspaper that's still around called The Forward, which is the oldest and largest Jewish newspaper in the country. And I was there kind of hired as their Washington correspondent. And this was at the very end of the Oslo process. And I had an opportunity to kind of cover, I guess you could say, the collapse of that process. And then very shortly, less than a year after getting that job, I was hired by UPI to be their State Department correspondent, which threw me into the center of the fire to cover international diplomacy. Um, and it was I was a young man. So in that process of having to kind of cover, the end of the Clinton administration and the beginning of the Bush administration, um, I was also kind of learning as much as I could, reading a lot of books on the regions that I had to cover. It was a kind of, I like to think of it as almost like a graduate school without being at a school. So that was helpful. And I've always been very curious. I like to read history, and that's kind of, and so for me there's an element of fun, when I get an opportunity to dive into a new issue. But yeah, so that's basically how it was. And I cover a lot of things now. I cover politics and written about culture and stuff, but I think foreign policy, national security, statecraft, the intelligence world, those are the things that I really love to write about. And here we are as a middle-aged man. Yeah.
So everyone who ends up covering these topics usually has some moment that shapes how they see the world. Was there a turning point in your life or career that pushed you toward this path?
Well, before the run up to the Iraq war after 9/11, like way before that, I was covering the Iraqi democratic opposition and Ahmad Chalabi, but not just Ahmad Chalabi. I was covering the Kurdish opposition in Iraq and other elements of the opposition, the sort of Shia opposition in Iraq. And to me, getting to know some of the exiles, getting to know some of the people who were trying to take their country back, I just felt that it was a natural partnership, that America as an ideal is that, we're this great experiment as a democratic republic, and we represent certain universal values. If you believe those universal values, it's just not true that if you look at a country that is living under a tyranny like Iran is today, that, especially not true in Iran, but I'm saying it's just not true that everybody is just used to it. And that in fact, there is a sort of universality of a demand for a certain kind of dignity, respect, security, and freedom. And so that really, in the run up to the Iraq war, that's really what motivated me. I was not an opinion writer. Again, UPI is a wire service. It's like the AP, although it's diminished quite a bit since I was there, and it was already somewhat diminished then. But the point is that I wasn't writing op-eds. I started in this period in the run up. I guess I did write for National Review, the Weekly Standard, and the New Republic, but they were reported pieces, really. I didn't have the stature that I have today, so I wasn't as influential. But I supported the idea of the Iraq War because I felt that there there were millions of Iraqis who deserved to live in a better world, and that combined with the fact that Saddam Hussein, even though this is sort of this history is forgotten and airbrushed aside today by most people, he was a threat to his neighbors. He was a threat to U.S. national security interests. So when you have a kind of confluence of interests, much like we have right now in Iran, my view was that why not see how we can marry American power to democratic opposition movements? Now,
Fantastic. So,
yeah.
yeah,
But
please.
but I would say that I've also learned a lot since then, which is that one of the lessons that I take away from the Iraq war is that we're very good at toppling regimes. I believe that Iraq is better off than it was under Saddam Hussein, or would have been under one of his loathsome, monstrous sons. However, we as a nation state, as Americans, as a kind of, our institutions are really not capable of the kind of nation building that we thought we might be. And so that's another element of it, where I think this is happening after the Cold War victory. So we had a kind of hubris that we could do anything. But it's not really, I don't think our military is designed to have, 22-year-old, Marines manning checkpoints and training local police and, trying to settle disputes about in local tribal councils and things like that. We were asking our military to do. We don't really have the infrastructure to do that. We don't have the, I think, patience as a nation to do that. So I would not have supported the idea of like an invasion of Iraq where we were going to be the de facto, running the country for a while. And by the way, we didn't end up. We supported a new constitution and elections. It's a little bit more complicated than the story that the left tells today and many elements of the right. But I do think that you have to be chastened and sort of learn those lessons as well. So I'm still very much a person who believes that we should use American power. That I don't think that the tyrants of the world, whether it's Vladimir Putin or Kim Jong Un, or for that matter, the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, may he burn in hell. I don't think those people should be part of representing like the international community. I think that they destroy the international community. They undermine it. But at the same time, I also, you have to recognize the sort of limits of American power and, how realistic is it? So we are in new territory here. The president has authorized effectively a regime change war with no boots on the ground.
So you mentioned some great points. I will get back to them,
Yeah.
So before this, I'd like to know about you because you mentioned you have learned along the way. When people read your work today,
Mm.
they seek confidence and clarity, but every thinker evolves. What is something you believed early in your career that you later change your mind about?
That's a great question. Well, one thing was, what did I believe early on? I think now that our capabilities to find sleeper cells and to actually root out terror networks as opposed to sort of lone wolves who are inspired by radicalism, I thought that we were going to be living with that, for the rest of our lives. I think what's happened is that we've gotten very good. Part of it's modern surveillance technology, but a lot of it is just we've learned how to track and disrupt terrorist networks. So that's one thing. I thought after 9/11 that we were going to be living with that for generations, and we've gotten very good at that. So that's one thing I've learned about. I've learned. Um, the other is that um, I believed, or I wanted to believe, because I lived in Egypt when uh, the former president, late Hosni Mubarak, under pressure from the George W. Bush administration, allowed for Muslim Brotherhood parties to participate in legislative elections. And they did very well. And I covered those elections. And I believed that there was an opportunity with Islamist groups, political Islam, that if you let them participate politically in a system, that they would maybe potentially be tamed, and that their actual ambitions were, you know, could be more modest if they had to participate in the give and take of a democratic process.
But it's proof they can't.
Well, yes, I think after Hamas, won the legislative elections in 2005, there haven't been any elections since. I'm now of the view that political Islam is incompatible with democratic. So I would not be in favor of Islamist groups being invited into the democratic process. Whereas I would say maybe, I don't know, 20 years ago, I probably would have said, sure, let's give it a shot. Because the people that I interviewed in Egypt when I was living in Cairo, who were representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood, presented a very moderate face. But those were not the people who ended up a few years later after Tahrir Square being the people who, were in the brief interregnum of the Morsi presidency, were the people who were running things. They were instead purging all potential political rivals. And then, of course, we know what happens, conducted a military coup and put an end to that. And in my view, the old me, would have said, it's really important that we kind of do these transitions to democracy and respect these groups and so forth and so on. And now I think I would have a more flexible perspective on that, which is that, of course, I would like there to be I'd like there to be election. I would hope for there to be liberalism, but I also don't think that you can just, you know, invite everyone in, especially if there are dangerous and illiberal parties or movements like political Islam. So I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood should be allowed to participate in political elections. I think that the Erdogan experiment in Turkey is an example of a country that it was quasi-democratic before, but I think it's less democratic now that Erdogan is in power,
I see.
even though he did win legitimate elections.
What a great example. So, Eli, you've spent years covering intelligence agency, diplomacy, and wars.
Yeah.
What habits or principles help you stay intellectually honest when politics becomes very polarized?
Well, it helps to read history to understand intelligence and to understand really all of those things. So it helps to sort of understand that. I feel like I understand US Israeli intelligence much better than I did when I first started covering, because I hadn't read as much history, hadn't lived through enough of it. I think it's always important to not get into the trap of assuming that intelligence services have a kind of omnipotence, because we assume because they have access to secret information, secret knowledge, they must know things more than us. So we spend an enormous amount of time in the American media, or we used to, reporting on alleged secret intelligence assessments of things and giving it more weight because they would have a basis on some state secrets. The intelligence community is perfectly capable of getting things entirely wrong, even if they have access to sources of information that the rest of us in the public do not. And so it's important to understand that these are human bureaucracies. And what I mean by that is that human beings are flawed. They make mistakes. Groups of human beings make mistakes. There can be groupthink. There can be blind spots. So that's an important thing, but it cuts both ways, which is to say, it means do not treat the intelligence services as if they're 10 feet tall and that they are superhuman and they have a godlike understanding of things. So that's the one side. But the other side is that a lot of people who are susceptible or prone to believing conspiracy theories want to also believe kind of an inversion of that, which is not that the intelligence agencies are gods, that they are devils, but it's the same concept that they have special knowledge and special powers and therefore are secretly controlling events in the world. Usually it's not like that. I might, though, make an exception in just that it seems that Israel's penetration of Iran is so overwhelming and complete that it is almost as if it's not adequate to simply say that they have very good intelligence on Iran.
Right.
I think they have established almost, I don't know if they don't control the Iranian regime. I'm not saying that, but they have something more than just very good intelligence. They have a kind of real and unprecedented level of penetration, which I think is,
Definitely,
yeah,
definitely many insiders, so they're
yeah.
doing the job.
Well,
Yeah.
human, but also technical. And they have developed certain capabilities from just the intelligence side that, so they know when the top leadership, when and where they're meeting, and they're able to get them from the sky. I don't think we've seen a kind of sustained capability like that. They did the same thing with Hassan Nasrallah, the same thing with the Yemeni leadership. So these are capabilities I think that have been developed over 20, 25 years. We've sort of seen them demonstrated in the battlefield, so to speak, since the war that I believe began after October 7th against Iran and its proxies. That to me it's quite impressive for Israel. And I think it's one of the reasons maybe why Trump was willing to go along with the second Iran war of his presidency.
Where there are mixed messages coming out of intelligence, services that a threat is imminent, and then later, so a couple of days right now, what's happening,
Right.
they say it wasn't imminent, it was looming, so how do you interpret that kind of mixed messages, so it's politicized kind of, intelligence service, what they're doing.
The question about the imminence of the threat, I think, is a phony conversation. Iran was a threat. It was a sworn enemy of the United States and Israel. Calls for death to Israel, death to America. But it's not just their slogans. They were persistent. They wanted to build a nuclear weapon. And to me, that is such an obviously the world cannot allow that. They are fanatics. And so it wasn't, and it's not just it's like everything they were. I mean, let's just leave aside the tragedy of the 90 million Iranians who have to live under this death cult, where their leadership would prefer to have their people starved and living in deprivation so they can continue to try to kill Americans and Israelis and others in the Middle East through their terror networks or whatever.
Let me give you a better
Yeah.
example. So when they killed 30 to 40,000
Yes.
Iranian citizens in 2 days.
Right.
So I cannot imagine those kind of people, have got access to nuclear weapons. So I cannot imagine that.
Of course.
No way.
So we're in agreement here. I mean, so my view is like, well, okay, was it 5 years away? Was it 5 months away? It probably wasn't 5 months away because of Operation Midnight Hammer and Operation Rising Lion from this 12-day war. But, the reason why Iran now is because they were penetrated by Israel and so weak that this was maybe the best opportunity to end the regime. Now, that is a risky gamble because we don't know what's going to come next. And we are potentially opening up a series of things that I hope it isn't, but we have to keep open the possibility that things may be worse. There might be chaos and anarchy. Uh, what was once a regime that had a monopoly of force, a monopoly of violence over Iran, repressive monopoly of violence, but nonetheless, was, controlled the guns,
Right.
then becomes an insurgency and a faction that terrorizes Iranians and Iran's neighbors. So that would be bad. But my view is it's always kind of compared to what. And so, I think the critics of the war make a dishonest argument if they presume that what we saw, let's say, on February 28th, 2026 in Iran represented stability or represented something that was good. I think that was also a threat because you had at the top of the regime an Ayatollah Khamenei and everybody else. By this point, by the way, none of the people who might have wanted to reform or moderate the regime, they were all purged from power. they were under house arrest, some were killed, some were exiled. So you were dealing with what was like a fanatic core. So to say that, you would have to really convince me that, if we have this conversation in a year, you really have to show me how that whatever is in Iran in a year is worse than what I think was an unsustainable situation now.
No, it's definitely very complicated right now, but at the same time, I believe, so you cannot wait until it's too late. And this war was inevitable, so they found the right timing. As you mentioned, Islamic Republic at its weakest point, because people with bare hands couldn't even resist,
Right.
against these people, let alone to overcome and take over. So one thing I really appreciate about your work is that you often zoom out and look at history before analyzing the present. So let's start there.
Yeah.
If you had to explain modern Iran in a few key chapters, what would the essential timeline look like?
Well, I would start the timeline in the late 19th century under the Qajar dynasty with the initial revolts over the tobacco tax and the riots in Tehran. That is the precursor to what becomes what some call the constitutional revolution, which begins in 1905 and kind of ends in 1911. So that to me shows that since the late 19th century, there has been an organic desire of Iranians to have representative government, and to hold their leaders to account. On the other hand, and this is what I find so fascinating about the kind of the Persian riddle or the Iranian riddle, is that Iran has for 2,500 years, one could argue until 1979 with the Islamic Revolution, but also maybe you could argue after 1979, it was similar. The supreme leader is very similar to a Shah, but you've had, a history of kings. There's an expectation. So Iranians also respond to a strong leader, and, we in America have an aversion to monarchy. We have a kind of like, we're no kings. We had our revolution against a monarchy, and we believe we are a country founded on these kind of universal ideals. I think Iranians have a more subtle view. I think that they distinguish between what they would consider to be good kings and evil kings. So it's hard to say how that would kind of work out, because in the 20th century you have different versions of this. And there is this tension between the Majlis, the parliament, and the Shah at various points. But what I find interesting is that at key hinge moments, like 1925, Majlis amends the constitution to give great powers to the first Pahlavi dynast, Muhammad Reza Pahlavi, Reza Pahlavi. And then, right. And then after Iran is invaded in World War II by the British and the Soviets, the remaining kind of Iranian elites convince them not to end the Pahlavi dynasty. They exile, they exile the first Shah, but then, Shah Muhammad Shah, the son, who was a very young man, is then made the new Shah because they would assume he would be more pliant. And in that instance, after being invaded during World War II, holding on to the Pahlavi dynasty was an act of self-determination in many ways. It was kind of an act of Iranian national pride. And then the other thing is then you see, the current Reza Pahlavi's father, he is very much of a reformer in some ways, like his father, the first Shah, in that he introduces women's rights, he introduces land reform, which is a very big deal, and he uses the kind of autocratic power, the power of a royal edict, to accomplish many of these substantial reforms that people like Mohammad Mossadegh and the original generation of the constitutionalists wanted to accomplish in their own democratic revolution. It's sort of an irony. I'm not saying, by the way, I think that um, Mohammad Shah is a complicated figure in Iranian history because I have many criticisms. Towards the end of his reign, he became very insulated, he and his court lived very lavishly as there was a huge wealth gap in the country. And he seemed to sort of be unaware of the aspirations of the middle class that his reforms in many ways had largely created. Like they wanted a more political buy-in. And he was unable to really respond to that until it was too late. 1978, at one point, he says he's joining the revolution, which is insane. So again, I have kind of mixed views on that. And then it's my this is the Eli Lake theory of Iranian history. Not everyone necessarily agrees, But then I think what happened is that there really was a widespread movement that wanted a democratic revolution in 1978 that included lots of people, including Iranian liberals, Iranian socialists, all kinds of various political factions. And it was Ruhollah Khomeini who represented, a version of political Islam in the Shia religion that stole the revolution and purged out other competition. And that became apparent as soon as he returned to Iran from Paris, and he fooled the whole world. He fooled many Iranians, sadly, who were happy to let him lead the revolution, unaware that he was going to drive the country into a ditch. And my hope is that what we are seeing now is the beginning of the end of the Islamic Republic and this failed experiment. And Iranians will begin to take their country back. That is my hope.
So we have 100% agreement
Yeah.
on the fact that Khomeini, fooled people.
Right. But
This
I
is the
think it's
result
important
of
to say he stole the revolution. There was genuine anger at, um, there was anger at the Shah in 1978. There was a sense that he not only was out of touch, but that he was not a man to kind of continue to lead the country and address the legitimate grievances of a lot of Iranians. I mean, the example that I get into in the podcast, but I think it's a good one, is that he holds this lavish kind of party to celebrate the 2,500-year anniversary of Persian kings going back to the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And the main people who are at this banquet are all the kind of foreign guests and other royals from around the world. And there are very little actual Iranians who are there. This is a symbolic thing. I understand that, governments throw big parties. I'm not against that. And what I'm saying is that the optics of that would have been infuriating if I was an Iranian who felt like I wasn't making enough money to make ends meet, or I was worried about the economy or whatever it was. I would be furious about it. But what's interesting is that to the contrast, and you know this, you're Iranian yourself, people who were not born, who were not alive for this period of history, are now would look at 1970s as a golden age for Iran compared to what they have to live under now, which is where there's drinking water crisis, the currency is worth nothing. There are all the scandals. I've tried to follow it, of banks collapsing because of the graft of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, pensions being looted. This is no way. I mean, people despise that, and I do think I would like to believe in the power of nonviolent resistance. I think it's a powerful idea. Gandhi was able to liberate and gain Indian independence without an armed insurrection. So it has worked historically. Martin Luther King was able to achieve civil rights without armed resistance. But in the case of Iran, and I've talked to so many Iranians, that they said at a certain point, when the fear is finally lifted, there will be a vengeance against the people who have exploited us for so long and oppressed us. I just think it's there's going to be a kind of inevitability there.
right.
And I think people like Ali Larijani and the people who are at the top of the regime who've survived probably understand this as well, and they're going to fight like hell to hold on to power. And it'll be that'll be a struggle, real fight. I'm hoping that people win.
Main takeaway for me is that what you just mentioned is a great reminder for all of us to read history from reliable sources. It is very important. So when people outside Iran talk about 1979, often simplify it. But in reality, as you mentioned, the revolution involved very different political factions. What do you think most people misunderstand about coalition that created the Islamic Republic?
Well, I think most if it goes back a little bit further, I think most Americans and people in the West know a little bit of information about Iranian history, which is they know what the Operation Ajax, the CIA MI6 coup that they say unseated what they say the democratically elected Mohammad
So,
Mossadegh, and what they have no appreciation for the fact that Mossadegh himself, first of all, was elected by the parliament and technically by the Iranian constitution at that time, as amended in 1925, was appointed by the Shah, and the Shah had the power to fire him. So when they say coup, I often think of what a coup is when the head of the palace guard with, in collusion with the generals in charge of the military, go to the leader and with a godfather offer and a gun to his head and say, you have to resign. That's a coup. And that didn't happen in 1953 in Iran. What the CIA did is really, I see it as two things. They had ineffective black propaganda in newspapers that were already hostile to Mossadegh. And then they helped persuade the Shah who we like to think of as who has this reputation as being a ruthless autocrat. But in this period in 1953, he was an unsure, unsteady young man who was very close to leaving the country because Mossadegh wanted him out. So I would say there was a duel. And what the CIA, specifically a man by the name of Kermit Roosevelt, who is the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt, did was he persuaded him to use his power and to fire Mossadegh. At first, it didn't work. The Shah leaves. He comes back and he does it again. And the reason Mossadegh steps down is because Ayatollah Khashoggi, who is the Speaker of the Majlis and the most senior cleric in Qom, who was part of his coalition, turns on Mossadegh and riles up the street against him. Now, none of that history makes it into the kind of telling of the story. The only actors that the CIA meddled, and Mossadegh was just doing fine. They don't talk about the fact that Mossadegh had effectively had a fraudulent vote to dissolve the Majlis, amend the constitution. He had fired the Supreme Court. He'd fired many of the generals. He was consolidating power. He was acting autocratically, which is a kind of tragic irony because Mossadegh was the conscience of the Majlis in 1925. He was one of the only votes, the only people to say, wait a second, I don't think we should empower another Shah. We want to be a democratic republic. So there's a lot to admire in the full biography of Mossadegh. But even Mossadegh, when he becomes the prime minister, which is far more powerful than any kind of position today in the Islamic Republic, he can't resist the allure of autocracy in some ways. So that's the part of it. I like history because the more you dive into it, it's harder to say there are pure villains and pure heroes. I think Mossadegh is neither a villain nor a hero in the same way I think the Shah is neither a villain nor a hero. And the tragedy of Mossadegh in many ways is that after that, he's effectively kind of relegated to a internal exile in his home. He's out of politics. But he had tried again to exile the Shah. He had tried to, he shut down newspapers, he'd arrested editors and things like that.
Where do you put the role of his efforts, in nationalizing oil industry in Iran?
Well, another irony is that the Americans were not where he was absolutely right to try to nationalize the oil industry. The Americans, he went to the Truman and Eisenhower administration as to be sort of honest brokers, third party mediators in this dispute with the British National Petroleum, what eventually became BP, the British, who wanted to hold on to this revenue because it was an unfair contract that was originally signed under the Qajari Shah and was not representative. And I think that Mossadegh had absolutely the better of that argument, and he was correct. What Mossadegh didn't understand, and I'm getting a lot of this from Ray Takei's great book on the last Shah, is that the Iranians still didn't have a class of kind of technocrats that could run their oil industry. So if he wanted to have a dramatic scene where all of the Brits were kicked out of the country, which he did, there weren't like Iranians who had the skills to run this complicated industry at the time. They would get that in 15 years, I think, or less. But it wasn't at the time. The Iranian economy suffered, but it wasn't as if the Shah at the time was against nationalizing the oil. This is another part of the story that's often, and by the way, it wasn't even that the Americans were against the Iranians nationalizing their oil. It was really just the British. The problem is that Mossadegh had refused what were considered to be fair offers by the American side, and eventually had sort of proven himself, and then combined with all these other steps he was taking, to just sort of be like incapable of kind of making a deal and moving on with things. And that's really when, the Eisenhower administration said, all right, well, let's see what we can do. But the other part of this is that, lots of Iranian politicians, members of Mossadegh's own political coalition, were coming to the American embassy asking for their help to try to foment a coup, say something to the Shah, do something here. So that to me is it complicates the story. It's not just about how America is a kind of rapacious imperial power who wants to steal the oil from the Iranian people, because what do we know that happens after it? It's not as if the Shah doesn't control the oil revenues from Iran. It's not like he is, paying the exploitative arrangement ended. He didn't reverse the nationalization of the oil. That's not what happened. So that does not count to me as the sort of motivation. I think it's more that Mossadegh himself was alienating his own coalition. And I actually think he would have been toppled if the Americans had done nothing, if the British had done nothing. It would
Right.
have just been, I think that there were enough people in his own coalition who said, we don't want you to be the leader anymore, that he would have been forced to resign.
So that's fascinating. So looking back at the late Pahlavi era, debates are still extremely polarized. What
Right.
do you think both supporters and critics of that period often overlook?
Well, I think that the supporters of the Shah overlooked the fact that there was still a massive wealth gap, that there was still like something like a quarter of the country was living below the poverty line. Now, to their credit, that was a lot better than it was, you know, in 1925 or 1955. You know what I'm saying? It was the problem was getting better, but it was still pretty bad. And so that's the first thing. I also think that there were very humane, intellectual, and noble SAVAK directors. That's the SAVAK being the intelligence service, the security service. But there were also brutal thugs who abused their power in that job. So there were things, there was repression under the Shah, but but this gets us to the other side. It was often overstated by his critics. And it's never account for is the reforms of what is known as the White Revolution. And I think they also don't account for the fact that when Khomeini began emerging in the early 1960s as the primary critic to the legitimacy of the Shah during the White Revolution, that Khomeini was not some just nonviolent theologian. Like Khomeini belonged to a kind of radical sect of Shia Islam that encouraged, that believed in terrorism, and was willing to work with various, was willing to sort of have that as part of his um, broader kind of campaign. So that these were, it was not as simple as I mean, any honest person would say eventually we saw the true colors of Khomeini, but and then I think sometimes in all of this, we sort of miss key decisions. It's my view that in hindsight, maybe it's easy to say this, but the Savak director, the best Savak director there was, Hassan Pakravan, who met with Khomeini when he was arrested and played an important role in convincing the Shah not to execute him. Credit in some ways, but I actually think that he should not have listened to Pakravan. He would not have had this problem. Khomeini was a generational leader, and it was probably in his interest in retrospect to have taken the hit and killed Khomeini, because I'm not sure that there would have been a leader as charismatic as Khomeini that would have emerged, and maybe you would have had a more democratic revolution, or an opportunity of the revolution would lead the Shah to have another set of reforms or something like that. It's Khomeini who really poisoned it. And then the other big mistake that the Shah made was requesting in 1978 for Saddam Hussein to exile him to France. And that was, he was thinking, I don't want this lethal threat to my regime, to my monarchy across the border in Najaf, southern Iraq. But by sending him to Paris, he made him an international media figure, because let's face it, in 1978, there weren't that many, international journalists or television networks that were hanging out in Karbala and Najaf. But it's pretty easy to get a camera crew to Paris. And that was how Khomeini was able to con the entire world, basically, was through the series of interviews that he would give, where he would say that he, of course, believed that only Islam should be guiding from the background of democracy, and all this claptrap that he knew he had no intention of doing any of that. But he said it, and lots of people believed him. And the sad truth is that there were a few scholars in the West, like Bernard Lewis, who were familiar with Khomeini's kind of most important work, the Islamic State, where he lays out exactly what he wants to do. He makes it entirely clear what he wants to do. You know what I'm saying? He says, this is
Exactly.
the kind of system I want to build. But so many of the expert class, of the professors and CIA analysts and people who worked in Congress and European parliaments and so forth, were completely unaware of all of the scholarly work that Khomeini did, which would have told us exactly what he was going to do once he got power.
So the level of ignorance is unbelievable. Why no one paid enough attention. That's why, children of revolution in Iran, so they blaming their parents for being fooled by a cleric.
Yeah. I mean, listen, I kind of understand. I can understand that when you are trying to have a revolution, when you've had enough of living under the Shah, where you feel that it's not the worst situation in the world, but if Iran is an educated population with a long history, a deep and rich and fascinating culture. I say I'm not an Iranian, but I kind of fallen in love with Iranian culture. And it's not, I say Iranian and not Persian because it's not just Persians. Iran has always been a cosmopolitan place with lots of different peoples living under, this sort of system. And I mean, that's an idea that goes back to Cyrus.
Absolutely.
And so, in my view, it's not the same, but it reminds me a little bit of how the United States is a melting pot of different cultures and so forth, similar to Iran, is what I would say. So, that I understand a talented population that, many for the first time you have families that are sending children to college and university. They're encountering ideas like Shariati, who is, a brilliant socialist and also an Islamist, and he's very influential in this period. And so I understand that people are sort of young people, especially, are like looking around and they're saying, what future do I have in a system where the people who are rewarded with the best positions in society are there because, they have some connection to this corrupt ruling family? I'm very talented. Why can't I compete? Why can't I be, the head of a ministry one day or something like that? I totally understand that. They were restless for good reason. So I have sympathy. The part where I think they wanted to, that, Khomeini would say enough for them to believe that he was just this, cleric who didn't understand politics, and that they would be left alone to then run this new country, which, they wanted more freedom. That's the part of it where there were people who warned them, but not enough. And that's the part of it where it was real. And I think the first were, there was a great tradition of Iranians feminism going back to the 19th century in some ways, right? I mean, you have remarkable poets, women poets, and who have who had a profound effect on the kind of culture and the elites of Iran, going back to the Qajar dynasty. And when they wanted to march for women's rights and then they were intimidated by the proto Revolutionary Guard Corps and they were beaten up and they were, pushed aside, that they were the first, they were sort of new. It was like, wait a second, this is not what we signed up for. And then the absolutely brutal original trials where there would be like 15 minutes in front of, some absolute fanatic lunatic, and then they would be dragged out and shot in the neck. Awful. And then the corpse would be displayed in the newspapers, and everybody would see and that there's a reason why they want you to see that in the newspaper, that photograph. It's because it's a signal to everybody else: don't cross us, we're now in charge and we're willing to kill you. And we saw it again in January with the absolutely unthinkable. I mean, listen, the stories break my heart, but the idea that you have parents looking for the bodies of their children through unmarked, body bags. The idea that they would sell the bodies back for the price of the bullets. It's disgusting, and it infuriates me in a lot of ways. So I'm never gonna, I'm not gonna, I'm very glad that Khomeini is dead. Apparently, they've just named his son Moshtaba. I hope they kill him too. Of a lot of them. But at a certain point, I think there has to be an understanding that Donald Trump will, under no circumstances, send the American army into Iran to keep the peace, as we saw in Iraq. So he is looking for some kind of figure that will be strong enough to avoid anarchy. And then it's going to be up to the Iranian people to demand of that figure and what's left of the regime that it's time for, the kind of radical reforms. We could eliminate the position of the supreme leader, return the real rights of the Iranian constitution. And I mean, I hope it works. My hope is that there's someone there's some figures who are in the elites who have a little shred of a kind of dignity or connection to the pride of their country and the pain of the Iranian people that they're suffering, and that maybe their conscience, or maybe out of fear, they will go along with it. That's my hope. But again, hope is not the same as a plan. So
Right.
we'll see.
When you look at the Islamic Republic today, it's both ideological and pragmatic. How
Yes,
do you interpret the regime's real governing strategy? Ideology first or survival first?
I think it's ideology first, and I think that's clear. If they were just interested in survival, there were all kinds of off ramps. That state the ruination of Iran's economy could have been avoided if the regime had simply given up its quest for a nuclear weapon, or any number of things. So my view is that they were ideological. They were always more interested in spreading the Islamic Revolution throughout the Middle East, destroying Israel, than they were in making Iran great. And
There
that's
is a quote.
obvious. Yeah.
There is a quote by Karim Sajjadpour. He got this quote from his university professor, and seemingly that at the beginning of Islamic Revolution, so there were maybe 80%, ideologues, 20% charlatans, but right now it's reversed.
Right. I love that quote too. It's one of my favorites from him.
Yeah, and right now they are trying to survive for their own benefits because in sanctions they're benefiting from sanctions, they're benefiting from these everything. So and there are a group of elite that under any circumstances they are making money, and that's why they want survival. What's your take on that?
Well, I hope that's true if it's 80% corrupt as opposed to 80% true believers. And then the main thing is just you have to, and I do think this is quite, you can accomplish this, by the way. I don't think it's, you have to just change the calculus of fear. Right now, a mid-level or senior regime official has more to fear from the security forces than he does from being on a Mossad or CIA kill list. But maybe that calculation is changing given how successful the Israelis and the US have been so far in taking out top regime officials. And then the other part of that is if you then turn around and say, listen, your family will live in relative security and safety, and it won't be maybe as nice as it was before, but you'll have some future. Take the money. If they are corrupt, that's what they would do. They would look around and say, well, there's no future, the other way. So there's a hope maybe that that's the case. But even still, if it's 20% true believers, there's almost 200,000 members of the Revolutionary Guard Corps. 20% would be, and if there are 40,000 true believers that are willing to, uh, risk their lives to keep the revolution alive, that's an enormous problem since that we don't know of any groups in Iran, with the exception maybe of the Kurds, maybe the Baluch, that have anything like, that many people under arms. So that could be a huge problem. On the other hand, maybe what you do is I think there's a very good chance that the Iranian National Army, which was started by Reza Pahlavi's grandfather, well, I would imagine that they would probably be happy to defect to the transition to the new government. They were largely displaced by the Revolutionary Guard Corps, and perhaps they will find a kind of courage and steel to take on, whatever that percentage of true believers that will continue to fight one way or the other. But we have to
So we
worry
are
about that.
we are at the stage right now that we can just be hopeful. Let's be hopeful that that's the
Yes.
case. So
But let me ask, I would like to ask you a question, Amir, if I could. My question is, first of all, I think America and Canada and European countries have been blessed by talented Iranians coming to our countries and creating businesses and adding to our economy and our culture. I love that as an American. But do you think that you could see a number of Iranians who are living in the Iranian diaspora now returning to Iran and joining and offering their specialty, whether they're engineers or people who know how to fix drinking water systems? I mean, there's a lot of work to be done in Iran. And then would some of them, young men, come back who are, stirred by the brutality of January and everything before and what they did in women, life, freedom, and things like that? Would they want to return, perhaps, and pick up a gun in order to defend their new country?
100%,
Well, that would
100%.
be I would love to write that story for the Free Press, but I would also love to see it. I mean, that to me that's a game changer. Do you think that Reza Pahlavi would be the man to sort of be the leading figure to organize such a return?
So, as he mentioned, he's not looking for actually grasping the power. He has mentioned over and over again that I want to be the leader of transition, to
Right,
get people to a point that they are able to attend free election. That's what he's trying to do.
right.
And I really admire that. And there are thousands and thousands of people, if not millions, that are willing to get back. I'm not sure about, fighting with guns, but I'm 100% sure I would be one of them to get back and help to rebuild my own country. And I know many of people
Yeah.
in Iranian diaspora that they're willing to even take their capital, so their specialties, their expertise, and to help to rebuild that country.
Well, that is an important message I think Americans need to hear right now, which that there this passion from Iranians who've been living kind of in exile, that they would be willing to go back and rebuild the country, and in some cases fight for their country, because there will be a fight, I think. So that's important.
Of course. So, Eli, let's shift to the present moment. Right now, tensions across the region feel unusually high.
Yes.
From your perspective, what are the most important forces shaping the current escalation?
Oh, that's a great question. Well, I mean, listen, we have to notice one thing, which is that when the war started, it was Israel and America, and even Saudi Arabia was on the fence, although now we know that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was privately telling Donald Trump to go for it, even though publicly the Saudis were saying we're neutral. You know, so there was a lot of fear and anticipation kind of before the war, and you didn't know where all the Gulf Arab states. Now they're all looks like they're joining in on the war against Iran because the Iranians, I mean, their response has been, I liken it to the great movie the Al Pacino Scarface, the Brian De Palma film at the end, where he's like, "Say hello to my little friend," and just starts spraying a machine gun everywhere. That's the Iranian regime right now. And when they spray a machine gun, they're hitting all these Gulf states who now are like, "Well, that's an act of war, and we're going to join in." The United Kingdom started off not allowing us to use Diego Garcia, which is an important base in the Indian Ocean, and now they're on board. There's only the socialist government of Spain that has decided that they're not going to participate. But so what started off as it looked like a kind of unilateral U.S.-Israel war, now you have a lot of allies who are supporting it and willing to kind of go the distance. So that's an interesting dynamic. So that Iran, which one of its strategies is to try to divide America from its allies and divide Israel from any of its allies, especially America, is now seeing unprecedented military cooperation between Israel and America. We've never seen anything quite like this. These two countries fighting a war together where they're really equal partners, that the Gulf allies are not going to be neutral, that they've joined in on it. And their friends, their great power allies, China and Russia, are doing nothing of note to help them. And they are looking alone. And so they're just, I don't see their future. And, the hope is that there will be enough of those corrupt, rational actors inside of Iran who will cry uncle and then, sort of move towards a transition. At that point, by the way, if that happens, and I hope it does in some ways, because I don't know how politically sustainable a long drawn out war will be for Donald Trump. But if there is that moment where some figure emerges and says, okay, I'll lead the transition government, similar to what we saw in Venezuela, it is that as the moment when the Iranian diaspora and the Iranian people have to be very loud and noisy and say it's not good enough to just return to Islamic Republic light. We want democracy. We want to take our country back, and to sort of establish them. They can't do it now. They're dropping bombs. You know what I mean? It's perilous for the Iranian people, and I feel horrible. It must be terrifying. But there is this light maybe at the end of the tunnel. But I think it's also important that, as much as I totally understand why, Iranians who had to flee the Islamic Republic and living in Canada will look at what's going on and they would say Netanyahu and Trump are great heroes. I totally understand that they've slain Khomeini, one of the great villains of our era, and that is something that Trump and Netanyahu and the IDF and the Mossad and the CIA should be absolutely proud of. But it's also important to remember that America's interests in this are not aligned entirely with the Iranian people. And the Iranian people have to assert themselves and say, we are demanding at this moment not just a cosmetic change. We want a real change. And by the way, we all know what they are. I mean, this is the other thing. When people say we don't know what the Iranian people want, I'm like, are you kidding? Have you been paying attention? I have been covering this story now for 25 years. I can confidently say that what Iranians want is they want to eliminate the office of the supreme leader. They want to eliminate the council of experts. They want to eliminate the guardian council. They want to empower the majlis, and they want to return to a constitution that actually gives them a kind of representative government. Now, could there be a figure like the Shah or something like that in there? That is up obviously to the Iranian people. But generally speaking, we know what they want. They want to be able to print newspapers and have websites that criticize the government without fear of being arrested. They want to the women want to wear whatever they want in the streets without being arrested by these stupid morality police, which they've stopped doing anyway because the country no longer believes in this, barbaric interpretation of Shia Islam. I think they want prosperity. They want a government that actually cares about fixing the infrastructure.
So, in a very simple
Yeah.
term, people in Iran want a normal life.
Yes, that's
Just
great way
a
to say it.
normal life.
Right.
And they have sacrificed their lives, and their families. We do not want anything that has
Right.
got connection to this Islamic regime. Political change is something that needs to happen, for
Right.
Iranian, to get
I
to
think,
that
by the way, what
prosperity.
does Trump want? I think what Trump wants is to, in a few months or however, whenever it is, right? I think he would like to do it before the midterm elections. He would like to take Air Force One, land it in Tehran International Airport, and have a photo opportunity where he's walking down the streets and Iranians are cheering him as a liberator. And then he'll have a meeting with his board of peace, and there'll be some representative of the Iranians there. And he will announce that there will be hundreds of billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars in contracts to rebuild this great nation of Iran. And, the friends of Trump will probably get the first dibs on those contracts because that's how he operates. But that's what I think he wants. He wants the photo op. You know what I'm saying? It's up to the Iranian people to, do the hard work of establishing, one could say, the original promise of the 79 revolution, or one could even go back and say the original promise of the 1905 revolution. But it's up to the Iranian people to make to do the hard work there. And my hope is that, we're at a point where I think there's Iranian Americans, Iranian Canadians that I've met, Amir, are some of the most talented, ambitious people I know in terms of they're natural capitalists. They are natural entrepreneurs. Like I'm Jewish, my people have an advantage in that we value education. But guess what? I can tell you, I know this. I know so many Iranian Americans. They absolutely value. They want their kids to learn and go to school and succeed. I think that there are going to be a number of Iranian Americans who are like, I'm an American, especially the kids who were born in, the Gen Z and millennial Iranian Americans who were born here. I think they were like, hey, I'm an American. I love this country. So they may not return. But the point is that there are going to be a lot of them who are. And then that kind of infusion of talent hopefully will, help steer the country out of the ditch that the mullahs drove them into.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, we are seeing regional tensions expand beyond Iran itself. How do you interpret the strategic calculations of Israel right now?
I think to understand where the Israelis are coming from, there's a couple timelines. Israelis understood 30 years ago that the Islamic Republic was trying to build a nuclear weapon. This is in the late 90s, they understood that. And it forced them uh, refocus their to refocus the Mossad to focus solely on penetrating the Islamic Republic. And this war and Operation Midnight Hammer, and you could argue you can go back before when they stole all the archives of the nuclear program from a warehouse in Tehran. That's the fruit of like a generational, almost like Manhattan project, just focusing on an intelligence war against Iran. But it became acute after October 7th, because even though it may be that the Iranian senior IRGC actually didn't know that it was going to be on October 7th when you saw, the horrible pogrom that Hamas launched, that Sinwar, kind of commanded. But then it became clear that that was the opening salvo of a war, not just against Hamas, but a war against Iran and all of its proxies. And if you look around the region, Israel has prevailed. So that's what this is. This is the final step of that. I don't quite understand leftists who see that as, imperial bellicose warmongering from Israel. They were attacked. And the result is that in a place like Lebanon, you just saw a remarkable thing. The Lebanese prime minister just absolutely said, that Hezbollah may not join this war and fire into Israel. And so for the first time, we have a Lebanese government in like 20 years that is willing to actually take on the once mighty Iranian militia that had pretty much kind of taken over their country. It was the Turks who helped push Shara to finally topple Bashar al-Assad, but that wouldn't have happened if it wasn't for uh, the fact that Israel had decimated Hezbollah. So
Right.
all of Iran's regional proxies and their network have gone down like dominoes. I mean, the Houthis are still there, but they're even diminished. There still is the Shia militias in Iraq, but that's a little bit more complicated. But the dream of Qasem Soleimani is over. The axis of resistance is somewhat finished. And then the final piece of the puzzle is the head of the snake. And that's what this war kind of represents. And that's also in America's interest, by the way, because America keeps getting sucked back into the Middle East in large part because the Iranians continue to light it on fire. So if you really succeed in removing the regime or defanging it or having some sort of someone to fill in the void that is just demoralized or something for a generation and will just not continue to kind of go back to it, then that's kind of Israel's national security interests are taken care of. But that's not enough, and as I see it, for the Iranian people. The Iranian people have to do that next part of it. And I hope that Israel and America, and I suspect probably more so Israel, can be an ally in that regard. I mean, I know enough about the Iranian democracy movement to know that it is not artificial. It's not created by Israel. It's something that comes from the Iranians themselves. It reflects a real disgust with the Islamic Republic and the regime. But during the American Revolution, we had help from France, and that you know what I'm saying. Why can't Iran? Why can't the Israelis or the Americans or other outside forces assist Iranians in their goal to finally unseat the Islamic regime?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Iranian people demands and interests of Israel and Americans, are kind of aligned.
Right.
Not 100%, but,
No, it's
so
not.
it
And
was,
but we should be very aware, and not 100%. And Trump, it's interesting to me because on the one hand, I mean, I don't know if you read, I wrote a piece that Reza Pahlavi and his people didn't like, where I pointed out that he's not done a good job of bringing together the opposition and that it's unclear whether Pahlavi has the grit and mettle necessary to sort of be, the man on the white horse leading the revolution. But at the same time, I would also say he's the only real option. There's no other figure who has that national name recognition and commands the kind of respect that he does.
let's talk about a question many people are asking right now, leadership.
Okay.
If political change were to happen in Iran, leadership would become a critical issue very quickly. What qualities would a credible transitional leader actually need in a country like Iran?
Well, the transitional leader would have to be commanding the respect of various different factions and seen as somebody who was not press the interest of one group over the others. So that would mean like it couldn't be somebody who was a Kurdish nationalist, obviously, but it would also be, I don't think he would succeed if it was somebody who demanded that every Kurdish school in the Kurdish provinces teach in Farsi. So it would have to be somebody who appreciated the diverse population of Iran and the various interests and was a kind of seen as a credible, honest broker. Second, be somebody who I think would be seen as strong, who would be willing to use violence to make sure that violence didn't spread. That's very important. And to demonstrate monopoly of force. That's very important. And finally, it would have to be somebody who I think would show that they would not seek to become an autocrat themselves. And that's the best thing that Pahlavi has going for him. He has a track record of more than 30 years of saying he only wishes to be a transitional figure, and that after the transition, he would respect results of elections and may not even run himself. To me, that is the kind of humility that we would need in that kind of
Right.
figure. Those are the qualities that I would.
So Eli, what would a best case scenario look like for the Iranian people?
Well, a best case scenario would be if Reza Pahlavi could manage to bring and knit together the ethnic groups from the Baluch to the Awazi to the Kurds, but also the women life freedom movement inside the country, the unions inside the country who have demonstrated against the regime, and to kind of recognize that he's going to be that transitional figure. If he can do that hard political work and then also manage to get the National Army and others in the regime to defect to his side and create that kind of momentum, and then oversee this period of 1 to 3 years where you're rebuilding the country and preparing it for national elections. That to me would be a best case scenario. And if not Pahlavi, then somebody like Pahlavi in that role. But I kind of think that Pahlavi would, in my view, probably the best guy for the job. And I want him to succeed in that.
Eli, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you, Amir. Great questions. Okay,
Thank
next
you.
next year in Isfahan.
Yeah.
Okay, I want to see Isfahan. I've been to Tehran. I want to see Isfahan, and I really want to see Tabriz, which was the cultural wealth capital, for so much of the 17th, 18th, 19th century. It was the place. Uh, you know, I've those are the places I really want to see because it's a wonderful